Princess Lyra Thorne had never expected her 16th birthday to begin with explosions in the sky. She stood at her bedroom window in the royal palace of Verdania, watching streaks of fire rain down like falling stars, except these stars screamed as they fell. The communication arrays throughout the capital city sparked and died one by one, leaving an eerie silence broken only by distant crashes. "Your Highness!" Captain Marcus burst through her chamber doors without ceremony, his usually pristine uniform singed and torn. "We need to evacuate immediately. The orbital defense grid has failed." Lyra turned from the window, her long auburn hair catching the morning light. Despite her youth, her green eyes held a steel that reminded Marcus why the Thorne bloodline had ruled Verdania for 3 centuries. "What's happening, Marcus? Those aren't meteors, are they?" "No, Princess. It's an invasion fleet. The Zephyrian Empire has broken the Galactic Accord. They're targeting all human colonies simultaneously." Marcus grabbed a travel pack from her wardrobe, stuffing it with essentials. "Your father's orders were explicit. If this day ever came, you're to be taken to the Forbidden Woods immediately." The Forbidden Woods. Lyra had heard whispers about that place her entire life. Ancient legends spoke of creatures that predated human colonization of Verdania, being so powerful that even the first settlers had agreed to leave those vast forests untouched. No human had entered those woods in 300 years and returned to tell the tale. "What about my parents?" "The court," Lyra demanded, even as she allowed Marcus to lead her through the palace corridors. Servants ran past them in panic, carrying precious artifacts and documents. "The king and queen are coordinating the defense of the capital. They've bought us time, but not much." Marcus paused at a junction, checking his handheld scanner. "The Zephyrians have deployed atmosphere jammers. Our starships can't get through, and their ground forces will be here within hours." They emerged into the palace courtyard where a small hover speeder waited, its engines already humming. Lyra had barely settled in the passenger seat when Marcus gunned the engine, sending them racing through the capital's winding streets. Around them, Verdania's citizens fled in whatever vehicles they could find, while others rushed toward underground shelters. The irony wasn't lost on Lyra that she, a princess who had spent her life surrounded by the most advanced technology in human space, was now fleeing toward a place that remained utterly primitive and untamed. The Forbidden Woods represented everything humanity had moved beyond: wild, uncontrolled, dangerous. As they left the city limits, the attacks intensified. Zephyrian fighters screamed overhead, their weapons carving molten furrows through abandoned settlements. Marcus's speeder weaved between the destruction, its shielding crackling under near misses from enemy fire. "Why the woods, Marcus?" Lyra shouted over the engine noise. "Why not the military bunkers or the off-world evacuation points?" Marcus's jaw was tight with concentration as he piloted them through a barrage of falling debris. "Your father discovered something in the royal archives, Princess, something the first colonists left behind. He never told me the details, but he was very specific. If humanity's enemies ever threatened Verdania again, the heir to the throne was to seek sanctuary in the heart of the Forbidden Woods." The landscape began to change as they approached the forest's edge. The neat agricultural fields and planned communities gave way to wild grasslands, then to ancient trees that towered hundreds of feet into the sky. These weren't the genetically modified flora found throughout most human space. These trees were older, wilder, carrying an almost palpable sense of age and power. Marcus brought the speeder to a halt at what appeared to be an invisible barrier. The trees ahead seemed ordinary enough, but Lyra could feel something in the air, a subtle pressure that made her skin tingle. "This is as far as technology goes," Marcus said, his voice unusually quiet. He pulled out an old-fashioned compass and a hand-drawn map. "The electromagnetic interference from the woods disables all electronic equipment. From here, you go on foot." Lyra stared at the map, its parchment yellow with age. The drawing showed winding paths through an impossibly complex forest with various landmarks marked in symbols she didn't recognize. At the center was a clearing marked with a single word, sanctuary. "You're not coming with me." It wasn't a question. She could see it in Marcus's eyes. Someone needs to delay the Zephyrian pursuit. Buy you time to reach whatever your father believes is waiting in those woods. Marcus handed her a survival pack and an old kinetic rifle, one of the few weapons that would function without electronic targeting systems. "Your Highness, I've served your family for 15 years. I've watched you grow from a spirited child into a woman worthy of the crown. Trust in your strength, and trust in whatever legacy your ancestors left in those woods." Lyra embraced the gruff captain. Feeling tears she refused to shed. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. You too, princess. And remember, in there, you're not royalty. You're just another human trying to survive." With that sobering thought, Lyra shouldered her pack and walked toward the tree line. Behind her, she heard Marcus's speeder roaring back toward the capital, where smoke columns now rose like dark pillars against the sky. The moment she stepped between the ancient trees, the world changed. The sounds of distant battle faded to nothing, replaced by the whisper of wind through leaves and the call of creatures she couldn't identify. The air itself felt different, thicker, more alive somehow. Her handheld devices went dark one by one, exactly as Marcus had predicted. Following the map's cryptic markings, Lyra began her journey into the unknown. The path, if it could be called that, wound between trees so massive that it would take 20 people holding hands to encircle their trunks. Vines hung like natural curtains, and the canopy above filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. Hours passed, though without her chronometer, Lyra couldn't be sure how many. The forest seemed to exist outside normal time. She encountered streams of crystal-clear water that sparkled with an inner light, and flowers that chimed like bells when the wind touched them. Nothing in her education had prepared her for this place. It was when she stopped to rest beside one of the musical streams that she first heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but rhythmic, purposeful. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with each pulse. According to the map, she was still miles from the central sanctuary, but something was approaching. Lyra raised her rifle, though she wondered what good kinetic rounds would do against whatever lived in these primordial woods. The thunderous sound grew closer, and she caught glimpses of movement between the trees, something vast and powerful moving with surprising grace. Then it stepped into the clearing beside the stream, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The dragon was nothing like the mythical beasts of human legend. This creature was real, alien, and magnificent in a way that made her feel simultaneously terrified and awestruck. Its scales were deep emerald green with edges that caught the filtered sunlight like cut gems. It stood nearly 40 feet tall at the shoulder, with a serpentine neck that added another 20 feet to its height. Wings that could have shaded a small building were folded against its sides. But it was the eyes that stopped Lyra's heart. They were ancient beyond measure, holding depths of intelligence that made her realize this was no mere animal. This was a being that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, that remembered when humans were just another species crawling out of their birth world's gravity well. The dragon lowered its massive head until it was level with Lyra's position. When it spoke, its voice resonated not just in the air, but somehow directly in her mind. "So, the youngest daughter of the Starwalkers finally comes to our domain. We have been waiting a very long time, Princess Lyra Thorne." Lyra's rifle trembled in her hands, though whether from fear or wonder, she couldn't say. "You know who I am? We know all who bear the mark of the first compact. Your ancestor, Thomas Thorne, walked these same paths 3 centuries ago. He sought our aid against enemies who would have destroyed his people, just as you seek it now." The dragon's words sparked a memory from her history lessons. Thomas Thorne had been the first colonial governor, the man who had led humanity's initial settlement of Verdania. Official records said he had negotiated the preservation of the Forbidden Woods as part of an environmental protection treaty. But those same records were frustratingly vague about the details. What compact? Lyra lowered her rifle slightly, recognizing that if this creature wanted her dead, no weapon she carried would make a difference. The dragon settled onto its haunches, still towering over her, but somehow less intimidating in the relaxed pose. Your people were young then, as they are young still. They came to this world seeking refuge from wars among the stars. We were here first, but we recognize something in your kind, a potential that even you do not fully understand. Lyra's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. You're saying humanity made some kind of agreement with your people? But there's no record of intelligent life on Verdania before colonization. Because we chose to remain hidden. Your species has a gift for growth, for adaptation, for overcoming impossible odds. But you also have a tendency towards self-destruction. We made a bargain with your ancestor. We would share our knowledge with his bloodline, teach them to unlock humanity's true potential in exchange for protection of our sanctuary, and a promise that this knowledge would only be used to defend, never to conquer. The implications hit Lyra like a physical blow. Her family hadn't just been rulers by chance or political maneuvering. They had been guardians of some ancient alliance between humanity and the true natives of Verdania. The Zephyrians, she said, understanding flooding through her. That's why my father sent me here. They're not just invading Verdania. They're threatening whatever balance has existed for 3 centuries. The dragon's massive head nodded slowly. The Zephyrian Empire seeks to claim this world for its strategic value, but they also hunt us. Our kind exists on few worlds now, and the knowledge we carry is coveted by many species. They believe that by destroying humanity's hold on Verdania, they can claim both the world and whatever secrets we possess. Then, teach me, Lyra said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. If there's some power that can help humanity defend itself, show me how to use it. The dragon studied her with those ancient eyes, and Lyra felt as though her very soul was being weighed. Finally, the creature spoke again. The training your ancestor underwent nearly killed him, and he was a grown warrior with decades of experience. You are barely more than a child. I'm the heir to the Thorn legacy, Lyra replied. And right now, I may be humanity's only hope on this world. I don't have the luxury of being a child anymore. For a long moment, the clearing was silent except for the musical babbling of the stream. Then, the dragon rose to its full height, spreading its wings until they blocked out most of the filtered sunlight. Very well, princess. But understand this. The path ahead will transform you in ways you cannot imagine. The person who emerges from our training may bear your name and your memories, but she will no longer be entirely human. Are you prepared for that sacrifice? Lyra thought of her parents defending the capital, of Captain Marcus racing back towards certain death, of all the human colonies that might be suffering similar attacks. She thought of the Zephyrian Empire's reputation for brutality toward conquered peoples, and of the millions of innocent lives hanging in the balance. I'm prepared, she said simply. The dragon's expression, as much as such a massive creature could show expression, seemed to hold both approval and something that might have been sadness. Then come, young heir of the Starwalkers. Let us begin your education in the true power that flows between all living things. But first, you must have a name that our people can speak. I am Verdantis, guardian of the deep woods. What shall I call my new apprentice? Lyra straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her like a mantle. Call me Lyra. Just Lyra. Titles and bloodlines mean nothing if I can't protect my people. Well said, just Lyra. Come then, and learn what it truly means to be human. As Verdantis led her deeper into the heart of the Forbidden Woods, Lyra cast one last look toward where the capital city lay burning beyond the trees. When she returned, if she returned, she would no longer be the sheltered princess who had fled the palace that morning. The dragon had spoken truly. She would be something else entirely. But as explosions continued to flicker on the distant horizon, Lyra knew that transformation was exactly what humanity needed. The Zephyrian Empire had made a critical error. They had assumed that conquering human space would be like their previous campaigns against weaker species. They were about to learn that some sleeping powers should never be awakened. 3 weeks had passed since Lyra entered the heart of the Forbidden Woods, though time moved strangely in Verdantis's domain. The massive dragon had led her to a clearing where ancient stone structures rose from the forest floor like sleeping giants. These weren't human buildings. The architecture was too organic, too flowing, as if the stone itself had grown rather than been carved. "Your ancestors built these?" Lyra asked, running her hands along walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner warmth. "Built implies construction," Verdantis replied, settling his great bulk beside a crystal pool that reflected stars despite being open to the afternoon sky. "We sang these structures into being, shaped them with our will and the planet's living energy. This is the first lesson you must master, understanding that consciousness and matter are not separate things, but different expressions of the same fundamental force." Lyra had been struggling with such concept for days. Her human education, grounded in physics and engineering, rebelled against ideas that seemed to violate every scientific principle she knew. Yet she couldn't deny what she witnessed daily in this place. Plants that responded to her thoughts, water that flowed uphill when Verdantis desired it, stones that became transparent at his touch. "I still don't understand how any of this is possible," she admitted, sitting cross-legged beside the pool. Her once pristine royal garments had been replaced with simple robes that Verdantis had somehow produced from woven plant fibers, though she suspected they weren't entirely natural. "Because you think like a human," Verdantis said, not unkindly. "Your species excels at building tools to overcome limitations, but you rarely ask why those limitations exist in the first place. What you call physics, the laws that govern matter and energy, these are not absolute truths. They are agreements, patterns that consciousness has established to create a stable reality. That's impossible. Physics doesn't require consciousness. Stars burned before any intelligent life existed." Verdantis's ancient eyes held something that might have been amusement. "Did they? How do you know?" "Because your scientists have measured light from distant stars and calculated their age. But what if time itself is more fluid than your people assume? What if consciousness doesn't emerge from complexity, but complexity emerges from consciousness?" Before Lyra could formulate a response, Verdantis extended one massive claw toward the crystal pool. The water began to glow, and images formed in its depths, not reflections, but scenes playing out like a three-dimensional recording. She watched human starships fleeing burning worlds as Zephyrian battle fleets pursued them across space. The invaders weren't just conquering human colonies. They were systematically destroying any trace of human culture they found. Libraries burned, historical monuments were reduced to slag, and the survivors were herded into labor camps. "The war goes badly for your people," Verdantis observed. "The Zephyrians have broken the galactic accords that once protected smaller species. They seek total dominion, not just over territory, but over the very concept of freedom itself." Lyra watched in horror as the images shifted to show Verdania's capital city. The palace where she had grown up was now a smoking ruin. Zephyrian soldiers patrolled streets filled with frightened civilians, while their commanders operated from temporary structures erected in the royal gardens. "My parents," she whispered, "alive but prisoners. The Zephyrian admiral seeks information about you, where you fled, what significance this forest holds. They know something is hidden here, but not what." Relief that her parents survived warred with rage at seeing them caged like common criminals. Lyra stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the clearing. "How much longer will this training take? Every day I spend here is another day my people suffer." "Your people suffer regardless," Verdantis said bluntly. "The question is whether you will emerge from here capable of ending that suffering or merely joining them in death. The power I offer cannot be rushed or partially learned." Attempt to use it without proper understanding, and you will destroy yourself and possibly this entire world. The dragon's words carried such weight that Lyra felt them settle into her bones. She had seen hints of what he meant during their training sessions. When she had successfully moved a small stone using only focused intention, the effort had left her exhausted for hours. When she had tried to accelerate the process by forcing her will against the stone's natural state, the backlash had knocked her unconscious and left scorch marks on the ground around her. "Then, teach me properly," she said, turning back to face him. "No more philosophical discussions. No more gentle exercises with pebbles and leaves. If there's a war to win, show me how to win it." Verdantis studied her for a long moment. "Very well, but understand that what comes next will be dangerous. Your ancestor nearly died during this phase of training. He emerged from it changed in ways that his own species could barely recognize." "What kind of changes?" Instead of answering directly, Verdantis led her to another part of the clearing where a single massive tree stood apart from the others. Its trunk was silver white, its leaves a deep blue that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. When Lyra approached, she could hear something like whispers emanating from its bark. "This is a memory tree," Verdantis explained. "It holds the experiences and knowledge of every consciousness that has ever touched it. Your ancestors' transformation is recorded here, along with the memories of my kind stretching back millions of years." Lyra reached toward the tree, then hesitated. "What will happen if I touch it?" "You will experience the awakening process as Thomas Thorne did. You will understand what it means to extend your consciousness beyond the boundaries of your physical form. And you will learn whether your mind can survive contact with truly alien ways of thinking." The princess, though she had begun thinking of herself simply as Lyra, as titles seemed increasingly meaningless in this place, pressed her palm against the smooth bark. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. She was Thomas Thorne, first governor of Verdania, standing in this very clearing 3 centuries ago. But she was also Verdantis, young by dragon standards, filled with curiosity about these strange new arrivals from distant stars. She was a collective consciousness of trees, experiencing centuries of growth in moments. She was the planetary ecosystem itself, aware and vast and anciently patient. The human part of her mind screamed in confusion as alien thoughts flooded through her awareness. She experienced communication without words, existence without individual identity, time as a fluid dimension that could be stretched or compressed at will. The boundaries between self and other began to dissolve. Just when she thought her sanity would shatter, she felt another presence in the chaos. Thomas Thorne's iron will, refusing to be subsumed despite the overwhelming nature of the experience. She watched his memories of the first contact, understanding now why the historical records had been so vague. The early colonists had faced a crisis. Hostile forces, not Zephyrians, but another aggressive species long since extinct, had discovered Verdania and were preparing to annihilate the human settlement. Thomas had sought any possible aid, even venturing into the forbidden forest that his scouts had reported as seemingly empty, but somehow threatening. His meeting with Verdantis had begun as a desperate plea for sanctuary. It had evolved into something unprecedented, the first true alliance between humanity and an elder race, one of the species that had evolved consciousness long before humans had even developed language. But the alliance had required sacrifice. To gain the power necessary to defend his people, Thomas had undergone a transformation that connected his human consciousness permanently to the planetary network of life. He had become something hybrid, no longer purely human, but retaining enough of his original nature to serve as a bridge between species. The transformation had given him abilities that appeared magical to his contemporaries. The power to communicate across vast distances without technology, to heal with a touch, to command the loyalty of creatures that had never encountered humanity before. More importantly, It had allowed him to awaken dormant potential in other humans, creating a bloodline of guardians who could protect Verdania from threats that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Lyra experienced Thomas's final years through the tree's memories, watching as he had used his new nature to establish the foundations of Verdanian society. He had guided the construction of cities that worked in harmony with the natural ecosystem, had negotiated treaties with the planet's indigenous life forms, and had prepared for the day when Verdania might face threats from space once again. When the visions finally ended, Lyra found herself sprawled on the ground beside the memory tree, her body shaking from the intensity of what she had experienced. Verdantis waited patiently as she struggled to separate her own thoughts from the alien perspectives she had encountered. "Now you understand," the dragon said when she finally sat up. "This is what I offer, the power to transcend the limitations of individual consciousness, to become part of something larger than any single mind. But the cost is that you will no longer be entirely human." Lyra tested her awareness, immediately sensing differences in how she perceived the world. The boundaries between herself and her environment seemed more fluid. She could feel the slow pulse of the tree's life force, the quick flutter of small animals moving through the underbrush, even the geological heartbeat of the planet itself. The changes have already begun, she realized. The moment you touch the tree, yes? The question now is whether you will embrace the transformation or fight against it. Thomas chose to embrace it fully, but he was an adult with a lifetime of experience to anchor his sense of self. You were younger, more adaptable, but also more vulnerable to losing your essential humanity. Over the following days, Lyra learned to navigate her expanding awareness. Verdantis guided her through exercises designed to maintain her individual identity while accessing the vast network of consciousness that connected all life on Verdania. She practiced extending her senses beyond her physical body, learning to perceive threats from miles away and to communicate directly with the planet's ecosystem. The practical applications were staggering. She could now sense the location and movements of every Zephyrian soldier on the planet. She could feel the pain of enslaved human civilians and the growing desperation of the resistance movements forming in the occupied territories. Most remarkably, she could access the ancient knowledge stored in the planetary network, technologies and abilities that the elder races had developed over millions of years. But with expanded awareness came expanded responsibility. Every day that she spent in training, more humans died under Zephyrian rule. The occupying forces were growing bolder, more brutal, as they realized that no rescue was coming from the broader human space fleet. It was during her 4th week of training that the crisis reached its peak. Through her connection to the planetary network, Lyra sensed massive energy signatures approaching Verdania's atmosphere. A Zephyrian battle fleet far larger than the initial invasion force. "They're bringing in dreadnoughts," she reported to Verdantis, her enhanced senses reading the ship's configurations from their gravitational disturbances. Enough firepower to sterilize the planet's surface. Verdantis' great head lifted, his own awareness extending into space. Yes, they have grown impatient with the occupation. The resistance has been more effective than they anticipated, and they have detected anomalous energy readings from this forest. They intend to eliminate any possible threat by destroying Verdania entirely. How long do we have? 3 days before they achieve orbital bombardment position. Lyra stood, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. The girl who had fled the palace a month ago was gone, replaced by something that was still recognizably her, but enhanced beyond anything purely human. She could feel Thomas Thorne's approval echoing through the memory tree, along with the patient support of every elder race consciousness that had ever walked these paths. "Then it's time," she said simply. Verdantis regarded her with those ancient eyes, and for the first time since their meeting, she saw something that might have been pride in their depths. "Yes, young guardian, it is time to show the Zephyrian Empire what they have awakened. But first you must learn to fly." Verdantis had explained the theory carefully. How to extend her consciousness into the planetary energy grid, how to align her personal biofield with the magnetic forces that flowed beneath Verdania's surface, how to achieve the delicate balance between gravity manipulation and momentum conservation that true flight required. But theory and practice, as she discovered, were entirely different things. Her first attempt launched her 300 feet into the air before her concentration shattered and gravity reclaimed her. Only Verdantis's lightning-quick intervention, catching her in his massive claws, prevented her from becoming a crater in the forest floor. Flight is not about defying natural law, he explained as she recovered her breath. It is about understanding that what you call natural law is simply the current consensus of consciousness about how reality should behave. Change the consensus, and you change the law. Easy for you to say, Lyra muttered, rubbing her bruised ribs. Your species evolved for this. I'm working with a human nervous system that was never designed to process gravitational fields as sensory input, which is precisely why your potential is so remarkable, Verdantis replied. My people were born with these abilities. They are as natural to us as breathing. But you're learning to transcend the limitations of your physical form through pure will and adaptation. In some ways, that makes you more powerful than any of us. It took 2 more days of practice, numerous crashes, and one memorable incident that left her temporarily stuck upside down 40 feet above the ground, but eventually Lyra mastered the basic principles of consciousness-directed flight. The sensation was unlike anything in her previous experience. Not the mechanical thrust of spacecraft engines, but a fluid extension of her own body's movement through 3-dimensional space. More importantly, she learned to merge her flying ability with Verdantis' own. When their minds linked during flight, they became something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness that combined human adaptability with draconic power. Together, they could achieve speeds and maneuvers that neither could manage alone. The Zephyrian fleet arrived exactly when Verdantis had predicted, emerging from hyperspace with the confident precision of a force that had never experienced defeat. 47 vessels ranging from fighter squadrons to massive dreadnoughts took positions in high orbit, their sensors mapping every square mile of Verdania's surface. From her vantage point high above the forest canopy, Lyra watched the enemy deployment with senses that now spanned electromagnetic spectrums her human eyes had never been designed to perceive. The Zephyrians were thorough, she had to admit. Their formation covered every possible escape vector while maintaining overlapping fields of fire that could sterilize continents. They're not taking any chances, she observed to Verdantis, their minds linked in the strange dual awareness that had become second nature over the past weeks. Whatever intelligence they gathered about this place has them genuinely concerned. As it should, Verdantis replied. Through their connection, she felt his ancient memories stirring. Recollections of other times when the elder races had been forced to defend themselves against species that mistook wisdom for weakness. They assumed that superior technology automatically grants superior power. It is a common failing among young species. The Zephyrian admiral wasted no time with ultimatums or negotiations. Within hours of achieving orbital position, the first bombardment began. Kinetic impactors rained down on Verdania's major cities, while energy weapons carved sterilization patterns across agricultural regions. The message was clear: total extermination, with no possibility of human survival. But the Forbidden Woods remained untouched, protected by energy fields that the Zephyrians could detect, but not penetrate or understand. Their sensors registered massive power sources somewhere in the forest depths, but every probe they sent into the area simply vanished without transmitting useful data. Lyra felt each impact through her connection to the planetary network, experienced the death of thousands of her people as a physical pain that threatened to overwhelm her enhanced senses. Only Verdantis's steady presence in her mind kept her functional as the bombardment continued through the day and into the night. "We have to stop them," she said through gritted teeth, as another city died beneath alien fire. I can't just hide here while they murder everyone I've sworn to protect. Patience, Verdantis counseled. They're revealing their capabilities, showing us the full extent of their forces. When we strike, it must be decisive. A half measure will only result in even greater destruction. The dragon's wisdom was sound, but every fiber of Lyra's human nature rebelled against waiting while her people suffered. She found herself pacing the edges of the forest clearing, her enhanced senses tracking the orbital positions of enemy ships, calculating approach vectors, and defensive formations. It was on the second day of bombardment that the Zephyrians made their critical mistake. Frustrated by their inability to penetrate the forest defenses, they deployed a specialized scanning array, a piece of technology originally designed for archaeological surveys, capable of penetrating deep underground to map buried structures. The moment the scanner's beam touched the ancient networks that connected Verdania's ecosystem, Lyra felt something vast and powerful stir in response. Through her connection to the planetary consciousness, she sensed awakening awareness in every corner of the world, not just the trees and animals she had grown accustomed to, but older intelligences that had been dormant for geological ages. They've made contact with the deep sleepers, Verdantis said, his mental voice carrying a mixture of anticipation and concern. Consciousness that have been resting in the planet's core since before my species learned to fly. The scanning beam has awakened them, and they are displeased. Lyra felt the truth of his words as tremors began to shake the ground beneath them. But these weren't ordinary seismic disturbances. They followed patterns too complex for natural geology, rhythms that spoke of intentional communication. Something immense was stirring beneath Verdania's crust, and it was very much aware of the destruction raining down from space. "What are they?" she asked, even as her enhanced senses picked up massive energy buildups deep underground. "The first consciousness to evolve on this world," Verdantis explained. "They withdrew from the surface millions of years ago when they transcended physical form, but they never truly left. They have been sleeping, dreaming the deep dreams that shape reality at its most fundamental level." The implications hit Lyra like a lightning bolt. They're going to defend the planet. Yes, but their methods may be somewhat dramatic. I suggest we position ourselves to take advantage of whatever chaos is about to unfold. They took to the air together, rising high above the forest canopy as the tremors intensified. Below them, the forbidden woods began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the reflected radiation of Verdania's sun. Ancient trees that had stood for millennia suddenly blazed with bioluminescence, their root networks pulsing with energy that registered on Lyra's enhanced senses as pure, focused intention. In orbit, the Zephyrian fleet detected the energy buildups and immediately classified them as weapon signatures. The Admiral ordered an immediate concentrated bombardment on the forest, deploying enough firepower to crack a small moon. The weapons never reached their target. As the orbital barrage descended toward Verdania's surface, the planet itself responded. Massive energy discharges erupted from points scattered across every continent, not from technological installations, but from geological formations that had been dormant since the world's formation. Lightning the width of city blocks lanced upward, meeting the descending weapons in a display of power that turned the upper atmosphere into a battlefield of competing energies. But even more impressive was what happened to the weapons that survived the initial defensive barrage. As they entered the lower atmosphere, they simply stopped. Kinetic impactors that should have retained enough momentum to crater continents hung motionless in midair, while energy beams found themselves trapped in recursive loops that sent them spiraling harmlessly into space. Localized gravity manipulation on a planetary scale, Verdantis explained, though Lyra could sense his own amazement at the display. The deep sleepers are rewriting the fundamental laws of physics in Verdania's immediate vicinity. Through her connection to the planetary network, Lyra felt the vast consciousness of the deep sleepers fully awakening. Their thoughts were alien beyond anything she had encountered, slow, patient, and utterly implacable. They had been dreaming for eons, and the Zephyrian attack had interrupted their dreams with violence and death. They were not pleased. What followed was a demonstration of power that redefined Lyra's understanding of what was possible. The Deep Sleepers didn't fight the Zephyrian fleet in any conventional sense. Instead, they began to edit reality in the space around Verdania. Ships that attempted to retreat from orbit found themselves unable to engage their hyperspace drives. The mathematical constants that governed faster-than-light travel had been temporarily adjusted, making such movement impossible within the planet's gravitational influence. Weapons that were fired at the surface encountered probability fields that ensured they would miss their targets, regardless of targeting accuracy. Energy signatures that should have been consistent across all known physics suddenly became variable, causing Zephyrian ships to lose structural integrity as their own power systems became unpredictable. Most remarkably, the Zephyrian crews began to experience direct mental contact with the planetary consciousness. Through her link to the network, Lyra felt their confusion and growing terror as alien thoughts touched their minds, not aggressive or hostile, but simply so vast and patient that contact with them drove many of the invaders in a catatonic shock. "This is our moment," Verdantis said, his ancient mind sharp with predatory focus. "While they're disabled by contact with the Deep Sleepers, we can strike decisively." Lyra nodded, feeling her own consciousness expand as she prepared for combat on a scale she had never imagined. Through her training, she had learned to merge her awareness with Verdantis's, but now she extended that connection further, linking herself not just to her dragon companion, but to the entire planetary network of consciousness. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying. She could feel every living thing on Verdania, from the smallest microorganism to the vast intelligences stirring in the planet's core. More than that, she could direct their combined will toward a single purpose, the complete elimination of the Zephyrian threat. Together, she and Verdantis rose toward orbit, no longer relying on individual flight, but carried upward by the focused intention of an entire world. Behind them, the Forbidden Woods erupted in a pillar of pure energy that extended from the planet's surface to the edge of space, creating a bridge of living light that they could use to reach their enemies. As they approached the first Zephyrian ships, Lyra felt the weight of her responsibility settling around her like armor forged from starlight. She was no longer just a human princess fleeing an invasion. She had become something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness wielding the combined power of multiple species, backed by planetary forces that could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality. The Zephyrian Empire had come to Verdania expecting to face primitive human resistance. They were about to encounter something that would shatter their understanding of what consciousness could achieve when it transcended the boundaries between species, between individual and collective, between the possible and the inevitable. The real battle was just beginning. The Zephyrian flagship was a monument to military engineering. 3 kilometers of hardened battle steel bristling with weapons that could sterilize planets. Admiral Corinth had commanded it through 17 successful conquest campaigns, and he had never encountered resistance that his superior firepower couldn't overcome. He was about to learn why the Elder races were called Elder. Lyra and Verdantis approached the massive vessel through what human scientists would have called impossible conditions. The space around Verdania had become a storm of conflicting gravitational fields, electromagnetic anomalies that turned vacuum into a soup of charged particles, and reality distortions that made navigation by conventional means impossible. But they were no longer navigating by conventional means. Connected to the planetary consciousness network, they moved through the chaos like dancers following music that only they could hear. The Deep Sleepers had awakened fully now, and their influence extended far beyond Verdania's atmosphere. Where their attention focused, the fundamental laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. "Target the command vessel first," Lyra said, Her consciousness merged so completely with Verdantis that she wasn't entirely sure which of them had spoken the words. If we can capture their leadership, the rest of the fleet may surrender without requiring total destruction. Through their shared awareness, they felt Verdantis's approval. Despite the power now flowing through them, he maintained the ancient wisdom that made the elder races so different from younger species like the Zephyrians. Victory was not about proving superiority. It was about ending conflict with the minimum necessary force. But as they approached the flagship, they encountered the Zephyrians' last desperate gambit. Admiral Corinth had recognized that conventional weapons were useless against enemies who could manipulate reality itself. Instead, he had activated his ship's most classified system, a consciousness suppression field originally designed for use against telepathic species. The moment the field touched them, Lyra felt her connection to the planetary network begin to fray. The hybrid awareness she had achieved started to fragment, threatening to return her to the limitations of purely human consciousness. "Hold on," Verdantis's voice echoed in her mind, but even his ancient mental discipline was being strained by the suppression field's effects. "Remember what you learned from the memory tree. Individual consciousness is just one note in a larger symphony. Change the key of the song, and the note remains true." Lyra understood. Rather than fighting against the suppression field, she began to adapt to it. Where it tried to sever her connection to the planetary network, she learned to route that connection through different channels. Where it attempted to limit her expanded awareness, she compressed that awareness into more efficient forms. The process was agonizing, like learning to see through a kaleidoscope while someone continuously changed the angle of the mirrors. But gradually, she began to function within the suppression field's influence, her consciousness finding new pathways that the Zephyrian technology couldn't detect or block. More importantly, she realized that the suppression field worked both ways. While it limited her connection to external consciousness networks, it also isolated the Zephyrian crew from any possible outside assistance. They had voluntarily cut themselves off from any backup or reinforcement, making their flagship a perfect target for capture. "Can you breach their hull without destroying the ship?" she asked Verdantis as they closed the final distance to the massive vessel. "Watch and learn," he replied, and Lyra felt his consciousness expand in directions that her human brain couldn't fully process. Verdantis didn't attack the flagship's armor with conventional force. Instead, he began to sing, not with his voice, but with harmonics that resonated through the quantum structure of matter itself. The song was complex beyond description, a mathematical poem that described the precise vibrational frequency needed to convince the ship's molecular bonds that they no longer wished to maintain their current configuration. Lyra watched in fascination as a section of the flagship's hull simply opened, not melted or torn or blasted apart, but gently reshaped itself into an entrance perfectly sized for a dragon and his human companion. The battle steel flowed like water, creating an airlock that sealed itself behind them as they entered the ship's interior. The corridors of the Zephyrian flagship were designed for beings considerably larger than humans, but smaller than dragons. Verdantis solved this problem by temporarily adjusting his own density, becoming partially incorporeal while maintaining enough physical presence to interact with the ship's environment. To any Zephyrian who witnessed their progress, it would have appeared that death itself was stalking through their vessel. They encountered the first resistance near the ship's central core. Zephyrian soldiers, massive reptilian beings in powered armor, attempted to establish a defensive perimeter using weapons designed to disrupt consciousness-based abilities. The weapons were effective against conventional telepaths, but they had never been tested against an entity that existed simultaneously in multiple states of consciousness. Lyra didn't fight the soldiers in any traditional sense. Instead, she extended her awareness into their minds, not to control them, but to show them exactly what they were facing. Through her connection to the planetary network, she let them experience the vast patience of the deep sleepers, the geological timescales across which the elder races measured existence, and the insignificance of their fleet when measured against the true powers that moved through the galaxy. Most of the soldiers simply laid down their weapons, overwhelmed by contact with perspectives too large for their individual consciousness to contain. Those few who resisted found themselves gently, but firmly held in stasis fields generated by Verdantis's reality-shaping abilities. "We're not here to conquer," Lyra announced to the ship's general communication system, her voice carrying harmonics that conveyed sincerity in ways that mere words couldn't match. "We're here to end this conflict before it destroys both our species." The response came from the ship's bridge, Admiral Corintha's voice, strained but still defiant. "Surrender is not in our nature, human. We will fight until every ship is destroyed and every warrior is dead." "That would be wasteful," Verdantis observed, his mental voice carrying enough power to be heard throughout the ship despite the suppression fields. "And unnecessary. Come to your bridge, Admiral. Let us discuss terms like civilized beings." The journey to the bridge took them through the heart of the Zephyrian vessel, past crew quarters and weapon systems that represented decades of military advancement. Lyra found herself studying the ship's design with her enhanced perception, understanding how every component had been optimized for conquest and intimidation. But she also sensed something else, a deep weariness among the Zephyrian crew. These weren't bloodthirsty monsters enjoying the invasion of human space. They were professional soldiers following orders, many of them questioning the necessity of the campaign they had been ordered to carry out. "They're tired," she realized, sharing the insight with Verdantis. "This isn't the first war they've been forced to fight, and they're beginning to understand that it won't be the last. The Empire's expansion is driven by fear, not strength." "Fear of what?" Verdantis asked, though Lyra sensed he already suspected the answer. "Fear of irrelevance. The Zephyrian Empire has built its entire identity around military superiority, but they're encountering species that can't be conquered through conventional force. They're lashing out because they don't know any other way to respond to challenges they can't understand." The bridge of the flagship was a cathedral of military technology, with Admiral Corinth standing at its center like a high priest of warfare. The Zephyrian admiral was an imposing figure even by his species standards, nearly 9 feet tall, with scales that had been scarred by decades of combat. His eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator, but Lyra could sense the uncertainty beneath his confident facade. "So," he said as they entered the bridge, "this is the mysterious weapon the humans have been hiding in their forbidden forest. A child bonded to one of the elder dragons." He studied them with professional interest rather than fear. "Impressive, but hardly unique. My people have encountered similar partnerships before." "Have you?" Verdantis asked mildly. "And how did those encounters end?" Corintha's silence was answer enough. The Zephyrian Empire's expansion had been halted before by species that wielded consciousness-based abilities, though they rarely spoke of those defeats in their official histories. "Admiral," Lyra said, stepping forward despite the weapons trained on her from every corner of the bridge, "this doesn't have to end in destruction. Your fleet is trapped in our defensive grid, your weapons are ineffective against our capabilities, and your crew is beginning to question the wisdom of this campaign. Withdraw from Verdania, and we'll allow safe passage back to your territory." "Unacceptable," Corinth replied immediately. "The Empire does not retreat. We cannot show weakness to the other species that resist our expansion." "Then, let us offer an alternative," Verdantis suggested. His consciousness expanded, and suddenly every being on the bridge could feel the vast network of awareness that connected Verdania's ecosystem. "Your empire fears irrelevance. But what if irrelevance is not the opposite of significance? What if true power comes not from conquering others, but from understanding your place in the larger pattern of existence?" What followed was not a battle or a negotiation in any conventional sense. Instead, Verdantis shared memories, glimpses of the deep history that connected all conscious beings, the cycles of rise and fall that had shaped galactic civilization for millions of years. He showed them species that had achieved genuine transcendence not through conquest, but through learning to harmonize their individual nature with the collective consciousness of life itself. For Admiral Corinth and his crew, it was a revelation that shattered their fundamental assumptions about power and purpose. They had spent their lives believing that strength came from imposing their will on others. But here was evidence of beings who had achieved power beyond imagining by learning to work in harmony with forces greater than themselves. This is what humanity discovered, Lyra explained as the alien perspectives settled into their consciousness. Not how to dominate other species, but how to become part of something larger without losing our essential nature. The partnership between human adaptability and elder race wisdom. It's not about one species conquering another, but about both becoming more than they could be alone. Through the ship's communication systems, similar revelations were spreading to the entire Zephyrian fleet. The crews found themselves experiencing direct contact with the planetary consciousness network, feeling the patient wisdom of the deep sleepers and the ancient perspective that measured time in geological epochs rather than individual lifespans. The effect was transformational. Ships that had been preparing for final, desperate attacks began powering down their weapons. Crews that had been ready to die for their empire's expansion started questioning whether expansion was truly what their people needed. Admiral Corinth stood in the center of his bridge, his worldview crumbling and reforming around the new understanding flooding through his mind. This changes everything, he said finally. If consciousness can transcend species barriers, if individual identity can be preserved within collective awareness, then conquest becomes meaningless. Why dominate others when you can learn to share their perspectives? Exactly, Lyra said. The question isn't whether your people are strong enough to rule the galaxy. The question is whether they're wise enough to become part of it. Over the following hours, a new agreement took shape. Not a treaty between enemies, but a compact between species recognizing their fundamental interconnectedness. The Zephyrian Empire would withdraw from human space, but they would also send representatives to learn about consciousness-based technologies and the principles of harmonious expansion. In return, humanity would share the knowledge they had gained from their partnership with the elder races, helping the Zephyrians find ways to grow and develop that didn't require the conquest of other species. The process wasn't instant or universal. Many Zephyrians remained committed to their traditional military culture, and some human colonies remained suspicious of any agreement with their former invaders. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual understanding rather than mutual destruction. As the Zephyrian fleet prepared to depart Verdania's space, Admiral Corinth requested a final meeting with Lyra and Verdantis. They met again on the flagship's bridge, but the atmosphere was completely different from their first encounter. "I have a question," Corinth said, his mental voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than hostility. "The transformation you underwent, the merger of human and elder race consciousness, is it reversible? Can you choose to return to your purely human nature?" Lyra considered the question carefully. Through her connection to the planetary network, she could sense the thoughts and experiences of millions of beings, could perceive reality in ways that no purely human mind could encompass. But at her core, she remained recognizably herself, the young woman who had fled the palace to save her people. "I don't think I'd want to," she said finally. "Being human was wonderful, but being more than human, it's shown me possibilities I never imagined. The question isn't whether I can go back, but whether I should. And the answer is no. My people need leaders who can think beyond human limitations. Then you will rule Verdania as this hybrid consciousness." "I'll serve Verdania," Lyra corrected. "Rule implies dominion over others. What I've learned from Verdantis and the elder races is that true leadership means helping others discover their own potential, not commanding their obedience." As the Zephyrian fleet departed, Lyra and Verdantis returned to the Forbidden Woods, where the ancient trees still glowed with the energy of the deep sleeper's awakening. The planetary crisis was over, but Lyra understood that her real work was just beginning. Humanity had been given a second chance, an opportunity to evolve beyond their current limitations and take their place among the truly advanced species of the galaxy. But that evolution would require guidance, wisdom, and the kind of perspective that could only come from consciousness that transcended individual species boundaries. Standing in the clearing where her transformation had begun, Lyra felt the weight of her new responsibilities settling around her like a crown made of starlight. She was no longer the princess who had fled the capital to save her people. She had become something unprecedented, a bridge between humanity and the larger universe, a guardian of possibilities that most beings couldn't even imagine. But as she looked up at the stars where human colonies were beginning to rebuild, where former enemies were learning to become allies, and with a future stretched out like an infinite canvas waiting to be painted with the dreams of united consciousness, she knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. The girl who had entered the Forbidden Woods had disappeared forever. In her place stood a woman who carried within herself the wisdom of dragons, the patience of planets, and the unconquerable spirit that made humanity worthy of survival among the stars. The galaxy would never be the same, and that Lyra realized with a smile that held both human warmth and draconic certainty was exactly as it should be.